Hi everybody, I'm Charlie, and this is On Air, my Beatles collection. Today I'm going to show you a couple of things that I kind of had deep in my collection, and I had almost forgotten about them. And they're not that old. There's two box sets. One is from 2013, and one is from 2014. I'm going to show you, and they're both limited edition. They both were produced in a quantity of 1964. Of course, to commemorate the year that the Beatles pretty much took over the world. They arrived in America in February of 1964. They were already a huge success in the UK, and were spreading like wildfire into other countries in Europe, and they came to America, and they conquered North America and the world. Anyway, so to commemorate 1964 as the year of that really taking off, these box sets that I'm going to show you were produced in quantities of 1,964, and they are numbered as well. So the first one I'm going to show you is this. Now these are not records. This is in this case, it is a box of prints, and it's commemorating the 27 number ones that are on the one album that preceded this album by several years, or this box set by several years. Again, there's no records in here. There are 12 by 12 individual prints of these different pictures, which would be picture sleeves from any one of the countries in the world, not necessarily the country where the song went to number one. When you open the box, well, first of all, I'll show you on the bottom of the box, that's where the number is. So this one is number 1768 of 1964. So as it says, Singles Print Collection, Series 1. I'm not aware that there ever was a Series 2. And the 27 number one singles cover, or we would say picture sleeve prints. And as I said, they're shown on the back. When you open the box, which is not always that easy to do, I'm trying to do it now. I will get it open. Trying to do it without hurting it in any way. When you open the box, you see this. So this is a paper wrap with a seal on it, and I did not want to break the seal. So I took the contents out one at a time from the end. So as you can see, it's kind of a pass-through thing. Again, I didn't want to break the seal, so I slid the pictures out one at a time until I got them all out. And now they're in front of me, and I'm going to show you them one at a time. So this one is for Love Me Do. I'm not sure what country this is. Maybe it's Japan. I assume it's Japan based on the print. It doesn't actually tell you what country this represents, but it says it's Love Me Do, which was recorded September 11th, 1962 at EMI. It became a UK single on October 5th, 1962. Became a US single on April 27th, 1964. And it was number one for just 1 week, and that was the week of May 30th in 1964. And on the back, it shows you that it also was from the Please Please Me album. So in every case, the back of these has a smaller version of the picture from the other side, and then an album that it was on. The next one is for From Me to You. And again, I'm not sure what country this picture sleeve represents. It doesn't actually say, and I'm not that familiar with all the picture sleeves from around the world. I'm pretty sure this was not a UK picture sleeve. And anyway, on the back it says recorded March 5th, 1963 at Abbey Road. The UK single was released on April 11th, so just a month later in 1963. And it was #1 for 7 weeks in the UK from May 2nd to June 19th. And it was a US single in May 27th, 1963. However, it did not sell in the US as a single in 1963. It did reach the charts in 1964 as a B-side, but it was not #1 in the US. And so there is what I just read you, and this one references the Red album. The next one is She Loves You. This is the American sleeve for She Loves You on the Swan label. You might recall that in the early days of pre-Beatlemania in North America, Capitol Records didn't exercise their rights to release the Beatles stuff. So smaller labels, in this case Swan, were able to release them. So She Loves You was recorded on July 1st, 1963 at Abbey Road. It became a UK single on August 23rd. It was #1 for 6 weeks, from September 12th to October 9th, and then again from November 28th and December 5th. It was a US single in September of 63, but again was pretty much ignored by the US market. But then later, after the Beatles conquered America, as they say, it did go to #1 for 2 weeks, all the way out in March of 1964. So, a good 7 months after it was released, it became a hit. The song that actually broke the Beatles in the United States as a hit in their first #1 in the United States was this one, I Want to Hold Your Hand. In this country, it was not backed with This Boy. It was backed with I Saw Her Standing There. And of course, it had a different picture sleeve. This was recorded October 17th in 63 at Abbey Road. And it was released on November 29th, 63. And it went to #1 for 5 weeks from December 12th in 63 through into January 15th of 64. It was released as a US single on December 26th, 1963. That was on the Capitol label. And it went to #1 for 7 weeks, starting on February 1st and through March 20th. Of course, you might recall that the Beatles arrived here in America that same first week. So when they arrived, they were already at #1 on the US charts. So this truly was what broke Beatlemania. This was the first sound of the Beatles that most Americans heard, was this song. The first one that was really played extensively on the radio. And then once they had their appearance on television and started their little mini US tour, and all the other stuff that had been released earlier came back and wound up on the charts. The next #1 was Can't Buy Me Love. And this is not the sleeve, of course, that was released in the US. The US sleeve on Capitol is now one of the most valued collectible sleeves. It features a Diesel Hoffman picture that was also used on several other records by Capitol Records. But in this case, it's a French version. It was released in recorded January 29th, 64, just before the Beatles left France to come to the US. And famously, there is a scene, I believe it's in the Beatles' first visit. It might have been in the Beatles 64 Disney Plus show from last year, where Brian Epstein gets the call that the Beatles are #1 in America. I believe that, even though I just said a minute ago that it was March 1st, I believe they were aware in advance that the record, when the February 1st top, Billboard list came out, it was gonna be post-dated rather. Sorry, to March. I keep saying March, to February 1st, but they found this out in the last week of January while they were still in France. So they knew they were going to America as with the #1 song in the charts. So anyway, they actually recorded this song on January 29th at the Path Marconi studio in Paris. And then it got finished off at February 25th at Abbey Road. It was released on March 20th in the UK. It went to #1 for 3 weeks in the UK, starting in April of 64. It was released as a single in the US on March 16th. And it went to #1 for 5 weeks, starting on April 4th. It was my understanding that Can't Buy Me Love had, up until that point, the largest advance sale of any record, of any 45. And I believe it sold over 1 million before it was released. Of course, the American charts are based not only on sales, but they're also based on airplay. So, of course, it didn't get airplay before it was released, but it did get to #1 in about 2 weeks after it was released in the US. So, anyway, that's the story of Can't Buy Me Love, and there's the mini picture from France. And, of course, that was also featured on A Hard Day's Night. Speaking of A Hard Day's Night, this is a picture that was featured on the American picture sleeve for A Hard Day's Night on Capitol Records. Hard Day's Night was recorded on April 16th, 64 at Abbey Road. The UK single was released on July 10th. Of course, they were recorded early, but they were released to coincide with the release of the movie. Anyway, the UK single came out on July 10th, 64. It went to #1 for 3 weeks from July 23rd into August. And then the US single was released a few days later on July 13th. And it went to #1 for just 2 weeks, starting on August 8th. And so there is the picture from that. Now in the US, there were really 2 albums that related to A Hard Day's Night. On Capitol, there was the album called Something New. And on United Artists, there was the soundtrack for A Hard Day's Night. And that, famously or infamously, did not include all of the songs that were on the UK version of A Hard Day's Night. Had fewer songs, and not only that, but several songs were replaced with soundtrack songs, featuring George Martin's orchestra playing instrumental versions of Beatles songs. That's because United Artists was primarily film-related company, and the contract with United Artists was for the Beatles films. So it was released as a soundtrack album, which were very popular here. So Capitol, on the Something New album, and as this single was released, they released some stuff from the Hard Day's Night on the Capitol album called Something New. But the album called The Hard Day's Night was a soundtrack album on United Artists. And it had a red cover, not a blue cover. The next #1 was I Feel Fine with She's a Woman. This was recorded on October 18th of 64, back at Abbey Road. The UK single was released a little over a month later on November 27th. It went to #1 for 5 weeks, December 10th, starting on the week of December 10th and into mid-January 65. In the US, it was released a few days earlier than that on November 23rd. It went to #1 for 3 weeks, starting on December 26th and into mid-January 65. And here we have Ocho Días de la Semana, 8 days a week. I'm not sure which Spanish-speaking country this was from. They reference Música de rock and roll music on the back. They reference Beatles for Sale as the album. And it says recorded October 6th and 18th, 1964 at Abbey Road. The US single was released on February 15th, 1965, and it was #1 for 2 weeks starting in March 13th. And it also appears on Beatles for Sale, as I said. Next one was Ticket to Ride. So Ticket to Ride was recorded on February 15th of 1965 at Abbey Road. It was released as a single in the UK on April 9th, 65. And it was at #1 for 3 weeks, starting on April 22nd and going into mid-May. The US single was released 10 days later on April 19th, 65. And it was #1 only for 1 week. And that was May 22nd in 1965. And of course, that was on the Help album in the UK. It was not on the Help album in the US. And speaking of Help, here is Help. Again, I don't know what country this would have been from. Those of you who are experts on international picture sleeves might know, but it's not referenced here, and there's no guide to tell us. This was recorded on April 13th in 65 at Abbey Road. The UK single was released on July 23rd, went to #1 for 3 weeks starting on August 5th in 65, and then the US single was released 4 days earlier on July 19th, 65, and it was #1 for 3 weeks in the US as well, and that was starting on September 4th. So it took about a month longer for it to reach #1, but like it was in the UK, it was #1 for 3 weeks. So here, of course, it references the UK version of Help. And here we have Gotta Hide Your Love Away and Yesterday. Yesterday is the featured song here that went to #1, of course. Yesterday was recorded on June 14th and 17th in 65. Its US counterpart as a single was released on September 13th. Of course, Yesterday was not released as a single in the UK until 20 years later. Anyway, September 13th, 1965 was the release date in the US, and it was #1 for 4 weeks starting on October 9th. And again, that was on the Help album. It was not on the Help album in the US. Next single, We Can Work It Out with Day Tripper. Day Tripper is what's credited with the #1 here in this particular collection. Day Tripper was recorded October 16th, 1965 at Abbey Road. It was released as a single in the UK on December 3rd, 65, and it was #1 for 5 weeks from December 16th into mid to late January. It was released as a US single on December 6, 1965, but Day Tripper did not go to #1 in the US. I believe we're going to see on the next picture when the other side, We Can Work It Out, went to #1. And here it is with We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper featured, and We Can Work It Out is the target here. Recorded October 20th and 29th, 1965 at Abbey Road. The UK single was released on December 3rd. It was #1 for 5 weeks from December 16th into January, so they counted it as a AA side on their charts. And so on both of these sheets, it gave credit for it being #1 for those 5 weeks. It did not give credit to Day Tripper in the US, but the US Release date for We Can Work It Out as the A-side was December 6th, and it was #1 for 3 weeks from starting on January 8th, 66. So it was #1 for most of the month of January, save for the first few days. I remember quite well in my adolescence. Let's see, in December of 65, I turned 11. And I remember very much hearing that sort of as the Christmas song by the Beatles. It came out, just around the time of, just before Christmas. I don't think I showed you the back of that one. It's got the Red album there as the reference album, and We Can Work It Out, Day Tripper, as the Red album referenced as well. Here's another one that I know for sure is a US sleeve, a capital sleeve, because I have all the capital sleeves. This is Paperback Writer with Rain. Of course, Paperback Writer was considered the A-side. Every time I talk about this record, I say this is one of the greatest double A-sides in history, because I love Rain and I love Paperback Writer, but Rain did not ever get its due as a #1. So this references Paperback Writer, and it was recorded April 13th and 14th, 1966 at Abbey Road. It was released on June 10th, 66 in the UK, and it went to #1 for 2 weeks starting on June 23rd. In the US, it was released about a week and a half earlier on May 30th, 66, and it went to #1 for 2 weeks also, and that was starting on June 25th. So it went to #1 roughly the same week in the UK as it did in the US, and the album referenced here is the Red album. This one is Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby. Yellow Submarine is considered the lead track here, as opposed to Eleanor Rigby. I know from my own experience here in the U.S., Eleanor Rigby was the song that got airplay in the U.S. But so what we have here is Yellow Submarine recorded May 26th and June 1st, 66 at Abbey Road. The UK single was released August 5th, 66. It was #1 for 4 weeks, starting on August 18th, 66. The US single was released on August 8th, and the song Yellow Submarine did not reach #1 in the US. And this references Revolver album. Okay. Next, we have Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby again. And that's because it was also a hit and also considered #1 in the UK. Pretty much the same dates. It was recorded 28th, 29th, and June 6th, 66 at Abbey Road. It was released on August 5th, 66. #1 for 4 weeks, August 18th into September. And the US single was released on August 8th and did not reach #1. And again, it references the Revolver album. Then we got this one. Penny Lane. Some would argue that was another double A side, but this references Penny Lane. Recorded December 29th, 1966 through January 17th, 1967. Of course, this at one point was destined for the Sgt. Pepper album, and the record companies were anxious to get a song out there. Didn't want to wait till the album was completed, so Penny Lane got released as a single on February 17th, 67. It got released in the US on February 13th in 67. And in the US, it went to #1 for 1 week on March 18th. It did not go to #1 in the UK. And of course, it didn't appear on an album until Magical Mystery Tour, which came out at the end of the year in 67, well after the Sgt. Pepper album dominated the summer and the early fall. So this was released before Sgt. Pepper, originally intended for Sgt. Pepper, but it was removed from the album, and it wound up the U.S. Magical Mystery Tour album. Unlike the U.K. double EP, the U.S. Magical Mystery Tour album pulled in a bunch of singles and their B-sides in order to to turn the double EP into a full LP. So you all know that story. And eventually that was the only U.S. created, Capitol Records created album that wound up being considered canon in the UK collection. It eventually became the standard worldwide, if you will. But initially, Magical Mystery Tour was a double EP that came out to coincide with the movie on Boxing Day in 1967. Now we have All You Need Is Love. It's another case where it was recorded in June of '67, right when Sgt. Pepper was climbing the charts. I probably was already #1 at that point, but this was recorded on June 14th at the Olympic Sound Studio in London, and then continued work June 19th through 26th at Abbey Road. The UK single was released July 7th, 1967. It was #1 for 3 weeks, starting in July 19th. And in the US, it was released 10 days later on July 17th, and it was #1 for just 1 week on August 19th, the week of August 19th. And as I mentioned a minute ago, this was featured only on the album Magical Mystery Tour. It was not featured on the UK double EP of Magical Mystery Tour, but it was one of the songs they used to flesh out the US album. And they also used Baby You're a Rich Man, I should mention. And they also used both of these songs, Hello Goodbye and I Am the Walrus. Hello Goodbye was recorded on October 2nd through November 2nd, 1967 at Abbey Road. The UK single was released a couple of weeks later on November 24th, 67, and it was #1 for 7 weeks from December 6th into late January 68. And then the US single was released on a few days later on November 27th, 67. It was #1 for only 3 weeks, and that was from December 30th, 67 into mid-January 68. And like the others, they were both included on the Magical Mystery Tour album. And then after those died down off the charts came Lady Madonna. This was also, in the US, Lady Madonna was the last record released on the Capitol label before the Beatles launched Apple. So this was on the traditional Capitol Orange Swirl label when it came out. But anyway, it was recorded February 3rd and 6th, 1968 at Abbey Road. It was released on March 15th, 68 in the UK. It went to #1 for 2 weeks, starting in the week of March 27th. And it was a US single released as a US single on March 18th. It did not go to #1 in the US. And it is now featured on the Blue album. And then came the Apple label, of course, and subsequent Beatles singles were on the Apple label. And the first one was Hey Jude, backed with Revolution. Again, some might argue that that's a double A. Maybe it is. This references Hey Jude. My recollection of Hey Jude, I've told this story a few times and probably some other videos. I remember going down to my town square looking for the single Hey Jude, and my record store there that I frequented had a whole box of them. They had a record 45 size box, that I think held 50 singles. And it had the apple on the box, outside of the box. I actually have one of those boxes up there in the cabinet, one of those Apple record boxes. And then the proprietor of the store took it out and showed me, and of course it was the black sleeve that said the Beatles on Apple. And then I saw the apple through the center hole in the picture sleeve, or the apple sleeve. And I actually literally got a chill up my spine, because it was so overwhelming to see this beautifully constructed product in this pristine black sleeve with the Beatles on Apple just printed across the top, and seeing the apple, the green apple on one side and the cut apple on the other side. And of course, when I took it home and put it on the record player, just the power of Paul McCartney's voice, coming in a cold start, with Hey Jude. And of course, Paul was at the absolute summit of his powers, vocal powers at that point in time. It blew me away. It was the greatest thing I had ever heard. We're talking about August of 1968. So I was 14. So this 14-year-old was quite impressed with that release. Up until that point, the Beatles had been. I was the third youngest of the Beatle fans in my household. There were 6 siblings. 2 of my brothers were much older and were already in the U.S. Air Force, and one of my sisters was out of school and working age. My other sister was in elementary school, 4 years ahead of me. So they were the girls were Beatle fans before I was, but I was, I went along for the ride. I enjoyed the music, but it became my obsession when this record came out. and really from that point on, I have never had a moment of not being a Beatles fan. And I don't think they've ever commercially released anything that I had access to that I didn't acquire. And it's all here in the room somewhere. But anyway, it was Hey Jude. Of course, this was, there was no picture sleeve in the US. There was just the Apple factory sleeve that said the Beatles on Apple, which was phenomenal. Anyway, it was recorded on July 31st through August 2nd at Trident Studios in 1968. It was released on August 30th in the UK, and it went to #1 for 2 weeks, starting on September 11th, 1968. In the US, it was released 4 days earlier on August 26th, and it was #1 for 9 weeks, starting on September 28th, going all the way through the end of November. And it was the longest running #1 song the Beatles ever had in the US. And I had no argument with that. I thought it was phenomenal. And not to mention, the B-side wasn't too shabby either. Revolution was a great song. Again, you could argue this was a double A, but Hey Jude got the credit. I'm sure John was never completely happy about that. But anyway, next we got also with a plain Apple sleeve was Get Back. Not pictured here, but Get Back with Don't Let Me Down. This was, of course, recorded in January of 1969. We all saw that recently in the Disney Plus Get Back movie, and originally in the Let It Be movie. This was completed at Apple Studios on January 28th, 69. It was released as a UK single on April 11th, 69, and went to #1 for 6 weeks. Starting in April 23rd of 1969. It was released almost a month later in the U.S. on May 5th, 69, and it was #1 for 5 weeks in the U.S., starting on May 24th and running through the end of June. Of course, that was featured on the Let It Be album. If you saw the Disney Plus Get Back Peter Jackson film from a few years ago, you saw what a lot of us saw for the first time, which was not in the Let It Be, original Let It Be film, was Paul kind of pulling Get Back out of the air and creating it as a melody on his bass. And you kind of saw that kind of get baked into becoming a cake-like thing. We saw the ingredients and we saw it come together gradually, and all of a sudden it was Get Back, the song we all know and love. So anyway, I remember that scene quite well. I think it got a lot of attention because nobody had seen that kind of a thing before. With a world-class rock band, creating a song on the fly. This was definitely a UK sleeve, and a US sleeve. I mean, I own this sleeve as well. This was the first sleeve to have a non-Beatle featured on the cover, and that obviously is Yoko in the picture there. Of course, the song is about John and Yoko, so I guess that makes sense. So the Ballad of John and Yoko was recorded on April 14th, 1969. Of course, Ringo and George were not involved in that. Paul and John played all instruments and did all voices. And, some people now argue about, is Free as a Bird really a Beatles song? Is Now and Then really a Beatles song if, they're not all there at the same time? This was a case, where we had a song that went to #1, and there's only 2 Beatles on it. There's a song called Eleanor Rigby we talked about before that has no Beatles on it except for Paul. And you could argue that about Yesterday as well. So anyway, this is the Ballad of John and Yoko, recorded April 14th, 1969 at Abbey Road. The UK single was released on May 30th of 69, and it was '1 for 3 weeks, starting on June 11th, 69. It was released as a single in the US on June 4th, 69. It did not go to #1, and I'll have to say it did not get a lot of airplay because of the use of the word Christ repeatedly. That was considered a no-no. Of course, we have evangelical South here in the U.S. that probably wanted to burn the Beatles at the stake at the time for blaspheming. American radio just didn't want to deal with it. So for the most part, you either didn't hear it at all or you heard it bleeped when they said that word. I don't actually recall hearing it on the radio at all. I did hear it on FM radio, which is not what drove the American charts. American charts were based on AM radio. They were considered top 40 stations. Mostly they only rotated the songs in the top 40 over and over. And the higher up they got in the chart, the more they rotated them. So you kind of heard the same stuff over and over. And, it was tough to break into the top 40 on American, charts because it was based, on airplay and sales. And a song like this didn't get AM airplay. It got some FM airplay. FM was considered more adult in general. Sort of like when we first had cable TV, they were able to get away with things they couldn't get away on broadcast TV. So FM radio was kind of the same thing. And so you might have heard it there, but FM radio wasn't in the habit of playing singles either. You could hear a whole album on an FM station. That would not be unusual, or at least an album side. And then, you get a commercial and some DJ talk, and then you get the other side of the album. But, they did play some songs, and there were stations that were more oriented towards the top 40. But anyway, that's the story of the Ballad of John and Yoko. Of course, the single was backed with Old Brown Shoe, I believe, was the other side of that, right? Next came Abbey Road, and we got a true double-A side, Come Together and Something. This particular page features Something, recorded May 2nd through August 15th in 69 at Abbey Road and at Olympic Sound. The UK single was released on October 31st. The US single was released a few weeks earlier on October 6th. This did not come together, did not go to number one in the UK, but it did go to number one in the US for just 1 week. And that was in late November, November 29th, 1969. And of course, both songs appeared on Abbey Road. And then here they are again. And this is Come Together, going to number one. And this was recorded July 21st through the 30th of 1969 at Abbey Road. The single was released October 31st, 69. The US single was released October 6th, 1969. And Come Together was considered a number one song for 1 week through November 29th. So just like Something, the A and the B were number one together at the same time in the US. And again, Abbey Road is the album referenced. And last, no, not last, almost last, we got Let It Be. This had a picture sleeve in the US. This is not the picture sleeve from the US, but it did have a picture sleeve. Anyway, this is Let It Be, recorded January 31st, 1969 at Apple, right after at the tail end of what we saw in Let It Be, the movie, and in the Get Back, the movie. It was released on April 30th. It was finished up on April 30th, 69, and then they went back and did more work on it January 4th, 1970. Of course, that would be to coincide with the album release. And it became a release single on March 6th, 1970. In the UK, it did not go to number one as a UK single. And then it was released on March 11th in the US, and it was number one for 2 weeks, starting on April 11th in 1970. And of course, it appears on the album Let It Be. And then the last single issued in the US, and the last one to go to number one, The Long and Winding Road. This was recorded January 26th and 31st at Apple, and then again April 1st, 1970 at Abbey Road. That would have been when Phil Spector got involved in both the cases here. The US single was released on May 11th, 1970, and it was number one for 2 weeks, starting on June 13th, 1970. And of course, it too was on the Let It Be album. And that was the last single released while the Beatles were still a band, and arguably they weren't even still a band at that point, because John had left and Paul had announced his departure, and the McCartney album, came out pretty much in conflict with the Let It Be album, and the rest of the history there. But there were many singles released later on, a couple that were just album cuts from previously, and we got various points in time. We got Obla Di Obla Da, we got Birthday, we got Sgt. Pepper / Day in the Life. We got a bunch of singles later on for the next 10 years or so. But the ones featured here are the original while the Beatles were a band, while they were still together. And, of course, those last couple came from the Let It Be album, which was, the last released album. It wasn't the last recorded album. That would have been Abbey Road. And then here in the U.S., we had other albums, mixed in that were not part of the UK canon, not the least of which was the Hey Jude album, which was a compilation put together by Alan Klein. So anyway, that is the box set of pictures for the single print collection series, and it's box number 1768 of 1964. And I don't know if you'll see this out in the wild, but if you do, you might think it's records. So look at it carefully and you'll realize it's not records, it's pictures. It wasn't particularly expensive. If that was a box set with records in it, it would have been a lot of money. I think it was maybe $50 or something. I don't know what it would go for now. It might even have been less than that. But anyway, that's one of 2 boxes. In the next video, I'm going to show you this one. So I'll just give you a teaser there. This one has a lot of stuff in it. It's not just pictures. There's a lot of stuff in here. So anyway, if you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you are not yet a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button. Certainly, if you have any comments or other information, or if you think I got something wrong, or, you know, I usually either say something wrong or think I'm saying, you know, June and I really mean August and that kind of thing. Maybe it's an age thing. I'm not 12 anymore. It's from a long time ago. But anyway, if you have any comments, don't be shy about that. And if you're not a member of my Facebook group called My Beatles Collection, please stop in there. It is a private members only group, but I have over 5,000 members there. And the intent there is to share each other's collection. I have enough stuff here that I can post something pretty much every day for the rest of my life. And I may very well do that. There are some days I miss, but I encourage all the members to show the things that they have that they think are unique, or they're just very proud of, or they just like them and they want to tell the world they like them. So come on over there. We'll have some fun there too. When I do videos here, I also link the videos on the Facebook page, so those 5,000 people are aware of the video. But there's many other things on there that other people post, and it's, you know, it's really mostly 99% still pictures there. I do not allow any sales there because selling is maybe the #1 source of scamming on Facebook, where people might take your picture from another post and claim it as their own and try to sell it, even though they don't physically possess it. And then they try to do a family and friends transaction that you have no recourse if they take your money and don't ever ship anything. So I don't allow any selling at all on the Facebook page. It really just is for fellow collectors to admire other collectors' stuff, or to show off their stuff, or to ask questions about their stuff. They can ask what the audience thinks the value is, but they can't offer things for sale. So anyway, we have some fun over there, and there's multiple posts every day. And as I said, there's well over 5,000 members there now. And I've only been in business there for about 2 years. So I think that's pretty good for a private group, in a short period of time. So come on over there if you're not a member there. And please subscribe here if you haven't done that yet. And I hope to see you again not too far down the road. Take care.